In the quiet hours, as the world slips from the grasp of the day and the shadows grow long, the figure of the witch has always loomed large in the collective imagination. Whether as a bent old crone, a sorceress under a full moon, or a misunderstood healer, the witch is a figure of fascination and terror. She, more often than not, witches are women, embodies a paradox, feared for her power but often marginalized and persecuted in society. From the caves of the ancient shamans to the bonfires of the Inquisition, the figure of the witch has been both revered and reviled, representing a complex intersection of power and the unknown. The history of witches is not just a tale of superstition. It is a mirror held up to society's deepest anxieties about gender, religion, and the limits of human knowledge. The witch's story begins in the mists of prehistory, in a time when humanity's understanding of reality was steeped in magical thinking. Living in a world where the forces of nature were often terrifyingly unpredictable, early humans sought to understand and control their environment through rituals, charms, and the invocation of spirits. It was here the earliest forms of what we might now call witchcraft began to take shape. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the world's first great civilizations, the line between magic and religion was blurred. The Sumerians and Akkadians believed that the world was populated by a host of gods, spirits, and demons, all of whom could influence human affairs. Magic, whether used for good or ill, was a means of interacting with these supernatural beings. In Babylonian text, the Code of Hammurabi was one of the first earliest legal charters and includes laws against the practice of sorcery, indicating both its prevalence and its perceived danger. If a man charge a man with sorcery and cannot prove it, he who is charged with sorcery shall go to the river. Into the river he shall throw himself, and if the river overcome him, his accuser shall take to himself his house. If the river show that man to be innocent, and he come forth unharmed, he who charged him with sorcery shall be put to death. This ruling for witchcraft and its punishment seems to have been bastardized and changed at a later date during the witch trials of Europe, wherefore there was no real escape from death for the accused. If you drowned, that was your fate. If you floated and survived, you were deemed a witch and put to death by fire or hanging. The figure of the witch begins to emerge more clearly in the classical era. In ancient Greece, witches were often depicted in literature and myth as powerful, dangerous women who could manipulate the natural world. The sorceress Circe, who appears in Homer's Odyssey, is a prime example of this archetype. Living alone on an island, Circe has the power to transform men into animals, an ability that both entices and terrifies Odysseus and his crew. Similarly, the story of Medea reflects the duality of the witch. She is both a loving wife and a vengeful murderer, a woman whose knowledge of potions and spells gives her the power to help or harm as she sees fit. One of the earliest records of a witch is in the Bible. In Book 1 of Samuel, thought to be written between 931 BC and 721 BC. It tells the story of when King Saul brought the witch of Endor to summon the dead prophet Samuel's spirit to help him defeat the Philistine army. As Christianity began to spread across the Roman Empire and beyond, the early Catholic Church faced the challenge of integrating and superseding the existing pagan beliefs. The gods and goddesses of the old religions were recast as demons, and the rituals associated with them were increasingly condemned as witchcraft. This shift marked the beginning of a long and bloody history. Accusations of witchcraft would be used to justify the persecution of those who did not conform to this new world order. The medieval period in Europe, spanning from around the 5th to the 15th century, was a time of profound social, religious and economic upheaval, a fertile ground for the denigration of so-called witches to take root and grow into full-blown hysteria. The early Middle Ages, often referred to as the Dark Ages, were characterized by a decline in centralized authority, frequent wars, and widespread ignorance and superstition. The Roman Catholic Church became the dominant institution, wielding immense spiritual and temporal power. It was the Church that would play a central role in defining and persecuting witchcraft. In early medieval Europe, witches were not yet the obsession they would become in later centuries. The Church's main concern was heresy, any belief or practice that deviated from its teachings. Many of those considered heretics were believers in Christianity who had chosen to rework their faith with colloquial folk variations. Believers in Christ who found themselves banished from the Church and slandered as immoral for not towing the line. The Church began to spread its own form of propaganda about these people, concocting tales of pagan rituals, orgies, and cannibalism. As the centuries progressed and the Church consolidated its power, it began to turn its attention to the control of magic and the supernatural. By the 13th century, witchcraft began to merge with heresy as a blight on religious progress, creating a potent mix that would lead to widespread tyranny and punishment. Heretical Christians were forced to form their own underground sects. Their practices continually sensationalized to depict absurd levels of debauchery and sin. Babies born out of group fornications were burned by tossing them back and forth over an open flame, their ashes baked into bread and consumed by the sect's followers. Demonic rites like these were invoked in the minds of Catholic and pagan populations alike as a way to completely ostracize heretics as false believers who shrouded their lust for destruction and chaos by posing as followers of Christ. A die was cast. Anyone outside the Catholic orthodoxy were swiftly being amalgamated into a monolith of evildoers. In ancient and pre-Christian times, various European cultures held beliefs in magical rituals and gatherings linked to fertility rites, seasonal festivals, and the veneration of nature. These traditions often invoked communal celebrations, feasting, dancing, and sometimes ecstatic or trance-inducing rituals, which were believed to influence natural forces or communicate with deities and spirits. The Celtic people had Samhain, the Germanic tribes Walpurgis Night. The veil between the human world and the supernatural realm was viewed as thin, allowing spirits and otherworldly beings to cross over. Such gatherings were not inherently evil, but were seen as part of the cycle of life and death, of light and darkness. As Christianity spread, these ancient festivals and rites, once seen as part of the natural order, were increasingly portrayed as diabolical. The concept of the witch's Sabbath began to take shape. The idea of the Sabbath as a gathering of witches in service to the devil gained significant traction in the late Middle Ages, particularly from the 13th century onward. This period saw the Church intensify its efforts to root out heresy and in doing so, also sharpened its focus on witchcraft. The Sabbath was often described in vivid and lurid detail by the accused, usually under great duress. Reports of attendance at these meetings varied. Witches travelled to the Sabbath by smearing themselves with special ointment that enabled them to fly through the air, or they rode on a goat, ram, or dog supplied by the devil himself. Favourite locations included the Brocken in the Harz Mountains, Germany, the Bald Mountain near Kiev, Russia, the Blockula, Sweden, and the Departement de Pays de Dôme, Auvergne, France. Attendees of the Sabbath had to pay homage to Satan by renouncing their Christian faith while trampling a cross laid at their feet. They must solidify their devotion by kissing the devil beneath its tail. The ceremony would begin, a frenzied feasting on the flesh of infants, followed by backwards ritualistic dancing. The climax would see women throwing themselves into unbridled sex with a host of demonic beings. Invoking this type of imagery in the minds of wider society was essential in what was a campaign of complete control. It was no mistake that the practice of magic was now presented as being inherently linked to the devil. Like the modern utilization of the psyop, the witches' Sabbath was a weapon of mass fear-mongering to justify what was coming down the road, a holy war of suppression and targeting of those rebelling against God. If the church was seen to be fighting against evil manifest, any actions it took would be deemed legitimate to restore purity and order. Europe was on the brink of being plunged into a climate of deep fear and superstition. Women who did not conform to the expectations of this society would be demonized as the main culprits, the unmarried, the childless, the elderly, or simply different, cast as dangerous outsiders who needed to be reformed or eliminated for the good of the community. The pivotal moment in the history of European witch hunts came in 1487 with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches. Written by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer of Germany and Jacob Sprenger, an Austrian, the Malleus was both a theological treatise and a practical manual for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. Kramer had been moving through the ranks of the church for the preceding decade. His aggressive zeal for his faith and popularity in Rome saw him landing the position of roaming inquisitor, which allowed him to travel widely in his uncompromising war against the enemies of the church. By 1485, Kramer was easily the most experienced inquisitor in Germany and was held in high esteem by his colleagues. Kramer's obsession with heretical activities morphed into chasing down the evils of witchcraft, and Rome gave him its seal of approval to prosecute those he deemed to be guilty of such practices, in the form of the Summus Desiderante, or witch bull, acknowledging witchcraft as a serious threat and granting Kramer the power he so desired. Kramer and his partner Sprenger, the Pope commanded, were neither to be molested nor hindered in any manner whatsoever by any authority under pain of excommunication or worse. After a period in which these soldiers of the church had taken to the road to perform their holy interrogations and punishments in various locations across Germany, he would write his extensive thesis on witchcraft as a rebuttal to his critics. The Malleus Maleficarum was born, and soon became readily available in printed editions containing the added authority of Rome's witch bull in the introduction. Witchcraft was now elevated to a pivotal position in the struggle between man and the devil, and given new responsibility for the world's ever-increasing ills. The book contained several stated objectives. First, it was to refute critics who denied the reality of witchcraft and hindered the persecution of witches. Second, it was to provide arguments and advice for preachers who had to deal with witchcraft on the pastoral level. And third, to lend detailed assistance to judges engaged in the difficult work of combating witchcraft through legal prosecution. In broad terms, each of the book's 3 sections deals with one of these issues while also addressing the 2 problems central to the work: what is witchcraft and who is a witch? Witches, in Kramer's view, were beings who were not and could not be imaginary, but who can, with the help of demons on account of the pact they have with them, and with the permission of God, bring about real harmful magical effects. What becomes glaringly obvious in the gendered language of the text is that both Kramer and Sprenger taught witches to be primarily female. The witch has offered herself completely and has bound herself to the devil really and in truth and not fantastically. She cooperates with the devil in body and in truth. They argued that although devils and demons were very real and could work evil on their own, they preferred to do so in communion with the witch. Therefore, these witches were the literal agents of the devil in human form and must be neutralized. Where ills were found, witchcraft was usually to blame, and where there was witchcraft, there was always witches. This is how these pious men wrapped up their theories neatly so their suspicions and acts of punishment would start to look uncontestable. Uncontrollable women were a grave threat to Christian society, capable of causing everything from failed crops to deadly plagues, according to Sprenger. The book placed emphasis on sexuality and reproduction, painting scenes of unbaptized babies offered up to the evil one, and the taking part in carnal acts with incubus and succubus demons. Both men specifically stated that the sexual link between demons and witches was responsible for the appalling growth of witchcraft in their day, serving to lure already immoral women further into sin, holding them in sexual servitude, and providing as well future generations of witches by performing coitus with these demons. It was a heady brew of fanaticism and a deeply misogynistic worldview of the times. The Malleus contained detailed instructions for extracting confessions from accused witches, including the use of torture, and quickly became one of the most popular and influential texts of the medieval period, spreading witch panic across Europe and laying the groundwork for the hunts that would follow. Over the next 2 centuries, tens of thousands of people were accused of witchcraft and executed across Europe. Reportedly, 80% of those put to death were women, most of them over 40. The hunts were particularly intense in Germany, Switzerland, and France, where religious conflict and political instability created an environment ripe for scapegoating. In these societies, witches became the embodiment of all that was shunned and hated. Women who defied social norms, practitioners of forbidden knowledge, the long-suffering outsiders on the fringes of a world set alight with religious fervour. A vast network developed across Europe, headed by the Church and its appointed army of inquisitors who shared and distributed the gospel of the Malleus Maleficarum. The Church provided the ideological foundation, secular courts administered the trials, intellectuals justified the persecution, monarchs and local rulers supported and even encouraged witch hunts, either out of personal belief in the threat or as a means of consolidating power and authority. Community members fueled the accusations, becoming informers and witnesses who gave testimony at trials, often to save themselves and gain favour in the eyes of the inquisitors. Finally, executioners and torturers were employed to extract confessions and mete out justice. a tightly knit web of persecution, meant escape was near impossible once the hammer of the Malleus came down. Women who were old, poor, or socially marginalised were particularly vulnerable, as were those who were outspoken, independent, or engaged in activities like midwifery and herbal medicine. In a society that valued female submissiveness and domesticity, women who defied these expectations were often seen as dangerous and in need of control. The Malleus put forth the idea that women were greatly more susceptible to the lure of witchcraft by way of their simple feminine frailty. Women were more credulous than men, more impressionable, more superstitious, more impulsive, more prone to emotional extremes. In some, more easily ensnared by the devil due to their weaker minds and bodies. This ideology would prove disastrous for women all across Europe as the witch hunts grew to levels that could be seen as an orchestrated genocide of particular members of the female sex. Torture was common and calculated, appearing in many forms, each with the goal of inflicting the most pain and suffering for the accused. The strappado. The accused was tied with their hands behind their back and then hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. The sudden suspension could dislocate the shoulders, causing excruciating pain. Sometimes weights were added to the feet. The rack. The accused was laid out on a wooden frame, and their wrists and ankles were fastened to rollers at either end. The rollers were then gradually turned, stretching the body and leading to dislocations and tearing of muscles and ligaments. Thumb screws. The thumbs or fingers were placed in a device that slowly crushed them as screws were tightened. Variants included larger versions that could be applied to the toes or even the head, known as the head crusher. The witch's chair. Also known as the interrogation chair, it was often made of iron and covered with spikes. The accused was forced to sit naked on the chair, while hot coals were placed beneath it to heat the metal, causing severe burns and agony. Water torture. There were several variations, including forced water ingestion, sometimes referred to as the water cure. Sleep deprivation. The accused was prevented from sleeping for days or even weeks, leading to severe psychological distress and often hallucinations. Fire torture. The accused were sometimes subjected to burning at the stake or had limbs or parts of their bodies exposed to open flames or hot coals. Fire was both a method of torture and execution designed to elicit confessions before death. The methods of execution were equally horrific: burning at the stake, hanging, drowning, stoning to death, beheading, disembowelment, garroting. Where feasible, these tortures and executions were performed in public, serving as both spectacle and warning to all those in the community who might step out of line. Hunts reached their peak in the late 16th and early 17th century, a period marked by intense religious conflict and political instability across Europe. By this time, the Malleus Maleficarum had been reprinted and distributed over 13 times. Its influence was immense. Mass witch trials took place in southern Germany, some continuing on for years and resulting in the execution of people of all ages, sexes and classes. Among them was the Fulda trials, which lasted for 3 years and saw 250 executions. The Ellwangen trials, 7 years long, 450 executions. The Trier witch trials, 12 years long, 400 executed. The Bamberg trials, 5 years long, 1,000 executions. These activities spread through France, Scotland, England, Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway. It was an epidemic of murderous brutality, instigated and voraciously encouraged by the Church and its men of God.